So welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you all at our third Create session and wonderful that you could take the time this afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I work and learn today. I'm on the land of the Darawal people and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. And you might like to acknowledge the land that you're joining from today in the chat. So just a reminder that we record each of our Create sessions and they're available afterwards on the YouTube channel through the Create Centre. So that way you can catch up on a missed one or go back and take another look at one that may support you in your research journey. So it's my real pleasure to introduce our presenters today. Michael Balfour is Head of School and Professor of Theatre and Performance at UNSW. And Michael's research explores applied theatre and performance work in a range of social contexts. He's currently the lead investigator on an ARC discovery project, Future Stories, a collaboration between universities and hospitals, which explores the social benefits of co-designing virtual reality experiences with young people in hospitals. And he's received numerous competitive national grants for projects including theatre and performance-based work in prisons, creative approaches to supporting the mental health of returning servicemen from Iraq and Afghanistan, and arts-based work with newly arrived refugee communities. So it's such a treat to have you with us today, Michael. Oh, yeah. And Guy Lobwein holds a Master of Philosophy and is a PhD candidate in the Creative Industries faculty at the Queensland University of Technology. And his research focuses on adapting the experimental creative processes of the 1920s avant-garde for art making in game engines. He works extensively with virtual reality technology, immersive multimedia spaces and contemporary art installation, exhibiting his work both nationally and internationally. And Guy's part of the interdisciplinary ARC Future Stories research team. And so it's a pleasure to welcome both of you and really thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And for those of you who are joining and observing and listening and engaging, if there are questions that you'd like to, or wonderings or comments or thoughts that you'd like to pop into the chat, we can explore them after Michael and Guy have presented for us this afternoon. So over to Michael and Guy.
Great, thank you. And it's really fantastic. We always love to talk about this work, so please tell us to shut up if we go on. You know, as Susan said, you know, my background is in applied theatre, which traditionally has been working in prisons, working with people with dementia, working with soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so that was very much invested in kind of in the theatre side of things. So it's a bit of an odd bedfellow to suddenly leap from that to being interested in virtual reality. And I thought I'd just give a little bit of context about why virtual reality and what I think the links are between that and theatre, and what I see are the benefits of theatre and the technology and the human and the technological coming together in kind of interesting ways. But when I first became interested in VR was actually when the UN commissioned a film, which was a United Nations film, which was developed to create a VR film which explored refugee camps. And they developed a VR film, which they then shot and then brought back to New York to show policymakers and immerse policymakers in the ways in which the camps were set up, highlighting some of the issues about the ways in which they were structured and the lived conditions, and the fact that sometimes the toilets were very far away from the people and the people were very far away from the kind of resources. And they thought it was a really interesting way for policymakers who wouldn't necessarily travel to these refugee camps to experience that secondhand, to have an understanding of the kind of human dimension of designing the ways in which the camps were working on a human level. And I thought that was really fascinating, that there was this really interesting use of technology to humanize an issue in a way that was really interesting. And so I then started heading off to all these VR festivals and going along to seeing various different examples of this. And this was like 6 or 7 years ago. And again, I was really fascinated by VR, because to me, it's like a brand new story platform. And, you know, this is like going back to the beginning of the 20th century when film was first invented, and Sennett brothers used to kind of go out and film like 2 or 3 films a week, trying to work out what the conventions of film were, and understanding, you know, what they made things funny, how action worked in the screen. And to me, the VR story platform is a very similar new kind of way of thinking about story and story worlds. But when I went to the VR festivals, one of the really, really striking things was many of the VR filmmakers tended to be documentary makers or feature filmmakers. And they thought in very narrative terms about the form that they were working with. So they would create a 360 film that was a narrative 360 film that had a beginning, middle, and end. It was just that you could actually look around within the scenes to see different things that might be happening. But it didn't seem to work. And I think my daughter at the time was kind of 8 or 10, and she was using Minecraft, and Minecraft, you're in this immersive world, you're constructing things, you're building things, and then you're teaming up with people in that world, and you're enjoying the discovery of the world in a way that was very different from a narrative-based driven element of story making. And for me, that was what was really interesting about VR, and continues to be, is that it's actually an immersive world, more like immersive theatre, if you like, where the audience has much more control over how they experience the narrative and the characters and the stories. And like in immersive theatre, two different audience members can go to the same show and see radically different experiences just by virtue of the fact that one turns right and the other turns left. And so that convention of mixing up the ways in which we might think of what a story world might be was really kind of what drew me to it. And there are a number of other different examples where artists had looked at VR, but then looked at where the connection between the technology and the social benefits of the technology might be. And that's really where future kind of stories, I guess, fits into this picture. But I guess at the same time, you know, I was reading all this stuff around, this connects back to the 4 Cs, around the ways in which, you know, 50% of future employment is going to be jobs that haven't been invented yet. And this was a matrix, which I think it was Time magazine published. And it was kind of like a fun matrix of various different fields of work which may materialize in the next few decades. I don't know how much you can see it. It's not terribly important, but the matrix is basically, here is low to high in terms of the economic impact of these inventions, and then sooner to later in terms of when these things might be invented. So here you have here in terms of low kind of economic impact, but things that are already kind of coming onto market, smart nappies. Is the one. Cryptocurrencies is up here. And here still on the sooner line, digital footprint eraser, mega scale destinations, medical tri-recorders and things like that. Then at this end of things like things that will be invented that people are already starting to working on is asteroid mining, vacuum tube transport, powered exoskeletons, balloon powered internet. And this was based on basically all the kind of science and technology that's currently being invested in. But what is fascinating to me about this is that as theatre makers and as educators, we are often actually operating at these intersections of disciplines. And I think one of the really fascinating things about, say, Future Stories is that, yes, we're working with virtual reality, but the team that we're working with is really interdisciplinary. And it's that feature of interdisciplinary, which I think theatre makers and creative people are very good at, because it's all about that intersection of the collaboration that we might have with a very, very diverse team. And some fields actually find it very hard to collaborate intersectionally with different disciplines. And I do think there's a strong connection between the ways in which artists and creatives think openly about the ways in which technologies and different ways of understanding the world can come together in kind of interesting and new ways. So in a sense, it's a provocation to all of us, this matrix, because it's asking us to think about what it is that's happening in the world, but also to us to imagine a very different world in which new kinds of things might come into play. So one of the engines that drive the VR worlds that we create is Unreal Engines 5, which is actually the organization which was established only about sort of 6 or 7 years ago in California, and they invented Fortnite, the game. So if you've got children or you know children, they came up with this blockbuster game called Fortnite, and they're an incredibly progressive organization. They've got a base in Sydney, and various different programmers and people, creatives, work in the company. But when we were talking to them in Sydney recently, you know, one of the things that was really interesting, I sort of asked them, so where do the people that you work with come from? What have they done with their first degree? And he said, the guy I was talking to, he said, well, 90% of the people that we employ either have a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. Because what is really fundamental is I don't need people who can just program. I need people with imaginations who can come to this technology and think about the usability of it and how people encounter this technology. And for me, that's a really interesting challenge, I think, to, well, ScoMo's old government potentially, about the ways in which humanities arts and creative arts can be seen with these new technologies kind of coming through that. So future stories. So this is the project that Guy and I are working on. And we have been working together with an interdisciplinary team of about 8 other people on this for the last 5 or 6 years. Very, very slowly, it has to be said. And the slowness is a feature of the collaboration, because it's actually been really important for us to work across each other's disciplines, understanding where the needs of each of the disciplines lie, but also understanding how the benefits of each disciplines can come together in really interesting ways. So Future Stories, the full title is Investigating the Benefits of Co-Designed Virtual Reality Experiences with Young People in Hospital. And again, you can see from that title what's important there is, first of all, obviously the virtual reality, the technology, the form that we're working with, but also that there's a very human component to the project, which is the co-designed aspect of the project. And so the ways, this is the team that we're working with, as you can see, really, really cross range of different people. So there's me from a theatre background. Anthony Herbert, Susan and Neil are all pediatrics and they're doctors. Lynn Sear is from arts and health worker. Jan is a filmmaker, but also an ex-pediatric nurse as well. Persephone Sexto specializes in working with younger people in hospital situation and has developed a beautiful practice, which is called Bedside Theatre, which is working one-to-one with children in England, in the NHS, developing creative projects and creative activities on a one-to-one kind of bespoke level with children. Margaret Gibson is a sociologist, and she's involved with the interview aspect of the process, but is fascinated by the concept of technology and death, grief and dying, and has done a lot of research around that. Guy, who you will get to chat to in a mo, is a fantastic VR artist. But again, you know, one of the fascinating things about Guy, and I won't embarrass him on the spot, that is that he comes from a fine arts background. He is almost first and foremost an artist who's interested in VR and new technologies, and that is a really important component. because he is one of the artists and residents who go into the hospital to work with the young people. And then Susan and Kirsty are from Sydney Children's Hospital, and Niels Cairns, and we also have a fantastic research fellow, Jenny, who has a theatre background. But this is a really complex team, and as you can imagine, the project is really kind of structured around a fairly simple, straightforward thing, which I'm sure you'll recognise, which is an artist in residence model, where two artists, one of whom is Guy and the other is Jan, who's a filmmaker. They go into each of the hospital sites, and we're working across 3 different hospital sites. One's Sydney, one's Queensland Children's Hospital in Brisbane, and one's in Cairns. And generally what we're aiming for is to run an 8 to 10 week residency in each site. This was actually fairly contentious right from the start to actually have an artist in residence model in the hospitals, because many of the medical research things would insist on you creating an intervention model, which tends to be you go in with a theoretical framework. It's set up that you would go in with a set of protocols that you might do, and even if it's a kind of creative piece of work, and you'd be testing out those protocols for their efficacy. But actually the pediatricians in the team were actually very comfortable with us in articulating it as an artist in residence model, which in some ways is much more a discovery approach, which is to say that the work that we do with each individual changes with every individual that we work with. And what we're trying to understand from the research are what are the things that we can generalize about the approaches to practice that we might take, learning from each of the individuals, but understanding what makes beautiful practice, what makes rich practice, what makes learning in these environments, and what are the ways in which we can understand and develop those kinds of concepts. The age range that we're working with is between 12 and 21. And the idea is that each individual that we work with develops their own story world. And so there's a co-design process that goes on where we will work with them over 5 to 6 sessions, getting them to sketch things out or draw things out, or some of them might suggest something, a world that they want to create. So in the pilot that we did, one of the participants we worked with wanted to travel to the moon. Someone else wanted to travel back to the village that they grew up in when they were younger. And someone else wanted to go on a BMX bike and ride around a BMX bike park in a virtual reality. So part of the co-design process is really about negotiating the story world that they want to create, and then working with them, sketching out various bits of design, coming up with particular aesthetics of the world that they want to create, and always coming back to them to check in with how that might look and what that might be generated. And then in its Guy's unenviable task is to work with them to co-design that, but then to generate the world in a VR world, so that at the end of that 5 or 6 sessions, they have a world that they can play with and go into and explore in all kinds of different ways. And I think one of the things we learned quite powerfully from the pilot that we did was one of the most interesting aspects of the work was that once they'd finished it, they were able also to explore the world, but they were also able to be tour guides of their world. So suddenly they were able to show this to the head of pediatrics, and the head of pediatrics would jump on a BMX bike and fall over and have an accident, and of course get laughed at by everybody in the room. And suddenly, you know, there's this beautiful, gentle transition there, which is about the kind of the status and agency of the participant in the hospital world changes for just a very short time. Because although the whole hospital context is built around the care of that person, they often experience that as being at the lowest end of the scale in terms of their status and agency in the process of their own kind of health and care. So this was a small creative moment where they had the agency to both develop it, but then also to be the tour guide of that world as well. And so I think just a few reflection, and Guy, it'd be great if you could add in your own reflections here as well. One of the things we are really trying to explore in this project is the notion of how technology and applied theatre co-design participatory process can work together in really powerful ways. And also to think about relationality and the ways in which different kinds of care might exist in the hospital environment. And from our observations, I guess, the nature of research is incredibly collaborative and highly interdisciplinary with the team. And where the challenges and interesting sparks from the research have been is that, of course, we're trying to accommodate very diverse disciplinary epistemologies towards a very strong, like one unifying research goal, which is to kind of explore these worlds. And trying to work out what our methodology was, or our research questions, and the language of that, and the discourses, it took us 4 or 5 years to mesh that together in a ways that we were all really comfortable with or happy with. But those discussions were invaluable, I think, in terms of creating a unifying working relationship where, when we're actually then going to go into the sites, we have a kind of common set of principles that we can work towards. And I think, again, one of the reflections, because it's been 5 years that we've been working in this time, doing a small pilot in 2019 and only finally getting the research grant at the beginning of this year. So 5 or 6 years to develop it up to a stage where we got a research grant. But the benefits of that have been an emphasis, I guess, just on when you're working in complex interdisciplinary environments, the benefits of a slow collaboration and a slow collaborative process, because it lends itself to a more careful approach to research design and a process that just acknowledges the disciplinary expertise, but also kind of accepting the nature of the collaborative, the nature of collaboration and how it disrupts traditional boundaries of knowledge, which takes me back to that first slide, is that these are open technologies and open epistemologies and open disciplines. And I think the more we are open to these different kinds of ways of thinking, that technology, but also the different ways in which the world is changing politically, economically, socially. And if we can grasp some of these new things rather than always going back to the traditional forms of discipline, then I think we're into a really exciting space. But it has to be one that's negotiated with real care and real ethics. That was it from me. Guy, did you want to add something?
I guess in terms of the project, well, thank you anyway for the wonderful presentation. It was fantastic. But yeah, I think the reflective, the idea of facilitating, I think, is super important, instead of particularly being about writing something for VR. It's about facilitating a patient's writing instead of your own as an artist. So placing the importance on the patient's desires, I think, is sort of like the main sort of thing that I got from it as an artist, and trying any way possible just to make that experience the one that they wanted, or the one that they saw as their vision and wanted to show people, because I don't think they would want to show something that they hadn't created or weren't interested in showing people. So that was sort of the main thing that I got from that side of the project.
It's really, really inspiring. And I've just been hearing about on some, I think it was the Economist podcast or something, about how they're using VR for pain management in really dynamic way. Like just that transcending where they are would be, so worthwhile, really cool. Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah, there's some really good VR in hospitals already. Rebecca, I don't know if you sort of had any experience of that, but I think they're very pre-programmed. I think a lot of the VR programs, so there are experiences that you put on the headset, which is very valuable. That you put on the headset, you have a VR experience, and there is some really strong evidence to suggest that it's distractive, but it also reduces the focus on pain, and also reduces anxiety, pre-surgery and those things. So that there's some really good evidence around that. But Rebecca, I don't know if you've had experience with that.
I haven't had any experience, or didn't have any experience with VR in that way, but I know there were other little programs and projects that were in the hospital. But as you said, Michael, very kind of preset that we could engage with the kids. And I think it was really lovely to hear you guys talking about like providing agency opportunities for kids to see themselves in these moments, because as you spoke to, Michael, in those settings, those kids, they often don't have any agency. It's all being done to them. There's very little kind of being done with them. And it was only when, that we would engage with the music therapist or the art therapist that there was any kind of opportunity for the kids to really have any input into that level of engagement. So it's really lovely to hear that in this project that you're giving, and I've got about a million questions I've just been like asking, but one that I'd love to, are we going to do questions? Is that all right?
I mean, we're a small group today, so why don't we just have it as fluid as we like.
So I'm really curious about the way you're facilitating or the processes that you're offering. And I know you said patients, my Guy, I'm going to just say learners, only because that kind of sets them in a different frame for me. Probably like what processes or facilitation are these kids kind of engaging in to get them from kind of that concept, because it's a pretty big concept, isn't it? Like build a virtual world, like that's pretty massive. So how are you kind of working with them to kind of help them synthesize where and what they want to create?
Guy, do you want to take that one?
Well, I think it's more of a you question, because I think initially it was, I think your idea about how to approach this, and it actually comes from a drama background rather than a visual arts background.
Yeah. So I'll say something, Guy, and then maybe you can sort of add to what your experience with the pilots were. I mean, I think it's always about kind of starting from where the participant is at, where the learner is at. And, all of you who have any experience of working with people, it is always about that. And I think each one was very different. So we've only done one pilot, which had 3 participants in it. And it was really just our opportunity to do a proof of concept, because we had an idea that this would work, but we had to kind of try it out before we went to the kind of main study, which has 3 different hospital sites. And I think each of the participants that we approached, it was a very different approach, because I think part of it was about building that relationship first. That was what I would say, is that even before we got on to story worlds, it was about, who is this person? What do they want? What do you mean artist in residence? No, I don't want to do it. I'm too sick. I don't want to concentrate on that, and so a part of the matrix of relationships is the closeness of working with the pediatricians and the hospital team, and saying to them and building up a trust about the project with them, first of all, because they're the gatekeepers. And they were the ones that we would sit with and say, look, here's the project, this is where we think it might work, what do you think? And obviously part of the research team is Anthony, and he was the one who was able to go, well, I think this person here might be interested, or this person here, let me see how I can sort of introduce you. And it was that slow process of building trust with the medical teams, first of all, but then second of all, building, introducing ourselves to the participant, and just starting really gently with just some thoughts. What's your favorite place, or where what is your, when you dream, what do things you dream of, or what's your hobbies, or sort of things like that. And it grew out of those kinds of conversations. But I definitely think so when we talk about the 5 to 6 sessions, that sounds like it's quite structured, but actually Guy will tell you that with the first session with one of them might have been 2 seconds, and then we'll come back, we'll come back later, they come back later, and maybe about 10 minutes, and then come back 2 days later, and it was maybe half an hour, and then and so it was all had to be very, very responsive to kind of where the children went. Guy, would that be your experience?
I think the most important thing was we had an ex-pediatric nurse, a part of the team, Dr. Jane Catoni, who's a filmmaker and already knows the relationships that are happening in the hospital and those sort of bubbles of care. So the ward, then the doctor, and then the family, and then to the learner. And it's like that. The initial prompts were actually just conversations. So it was about just talking to the learners about like how they what were they, how were they feeling, and like were they up for it? I mean, even from the start, it's like giving them the option to opt out and be like, do you even want to? And for one of the patients, they as soon as I walked into the room, they were literally like, I don't want to do it anymore. I'm not interested. I'm totally not feeling up to it. And I was like, oh, that's totally okay. Do we want to just talk about it first and then I'll leave? And by the end of the conversation, like they'd switched their entire perspective of the project to like, when's the next session? Like when do we start? Because we just talked about things like, and I think one of the good things was that it was just trying to not relate to their experience, but just be like, okay, like I'm just here to make art. And if you want to make some art with me, that sounds like a really fun thing to do while you're here. I'm not sure if that's what you want to do, but it's up to you. And then it just goes from there. And sort of, I think over the course of like the sessions, like part of their experience in the hospital started being reflected into the work that we were making. And I think that was really quite amazing to see, but also something that I didn't expect from the project. And like, because I didn't even know, but one of the BMX, the young man who, one of the BMX park, he basically had a hero who had, Scotty Kramer was his name, and he was a BMX rider, and he'd had a fatal fall and broken every single bone almost in his body. And he was told he was never going to ride again, and then ended up getting back on a BMX bike and riding again. And they had shut down his like BMX park while he'd been injured, that he'd like made from an old warehouse, and they'd converted and they shut it down. And this young man, he was like, I want to rebuild that. And, you know, and because that is like, that's my hero. And like, I want to see what it would be like to get back on the bike and bounce back from what I'm dealing with. And so these spaces, as I'll talk about, they're not necessarily like, it's not writing for VR, it's writing about an experience or making an experience that's a reflective space for not only the participant, but for the audience to come in and sort of feel something different from maybe a narrative.
Because it can be a very challenging space when you're kind of working with such vulnerable young people, when you're helping them make sense of stuff. And it can, you know, and this was it's a fine line when you start to kind of go into those therapy spaces that you don't want the work naturally kind of emerges as a therapization of what they need to make sense of. But it's really tricky when you're in like an education space, and how do you kind of maneuver between those places safely for that young person as well, and how do you make, you know, what you're offering, the offer that you're making, asking them to engage in, safe for them. So it's really lovely that VR kind of, it's such a lovely sense maker, isn't it? It can be a really strong tool for young people to make sense of their experiences at that moment.
Yeah, and I would say that we pretty well stayed clear of terming it therapy at all. It's not something that we're interested in chasing. It's about art making, and it's about finding reflections and working with technology. And whether someone classifies it as that, it's up to them, but it's not something we're going to do because we're not medical practitioners.
It's not your space, and
it's something,
Well, could I then piggyback a question on Rebecca's point? My information may be out of date here, but I believe there were some early studies on how younger children interacted with VR that found that when they were asked to recall the experience later, if they were young kids, they tended to recall them as memories rather than as
Experience.
they actually thought of them as memories, like as experience, memories of their own experience, rather than recalling, playing a game. And I am curious about how, given that you are in this very delicate setting, whether you've got any recent results on that, on whether on how they experience it on reflection.
I think that's a great question, Anna. I think it's still too early because we're really kind of at pilot stage, and I think my instinct would be that perhaps I think there is an element of the agency because they're involved in the creating of it, as opposed to it just being an entertainment thing which they're putting on an experience world that someone else has created. I think the agency in them constructing the story world potentially creates a little bit more distance in terms of that kind of intersection between memory and that, and also because of that notion of being the tour guide, because while they quite enjoyed playing in the spaces, they actually gained a lot also from being the tour guide to their families and to the doctors. And it became
that actually segues into my next question. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just in the chat. I have so many questions. My next question would be then, one of the problems that VR experience creators are constantly having to figure out is how to make the idea work in a room with more than one person, when you've got like one person there with the headset and they're immersed, but anyone else who's there is seeing, a 2D screen.
Yeah.
So I'm really fascinated about what solutions you found for that part of it, like getting the person with the headset interacting with the people who are in the room just looking at a screen.
Guy, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, it's mainly pop-up sessions. That was sort of our ideal way. I mean, the reality is the technology isn't at the point where it can be that dual experience. I mean, we are working towards that, and that's a tech question more so than, or I'm sorry, not even a tech question. It's the developmental technology, of the actual companies who make it. It's possible, but it's of course like highly dependent on the amount of money that we're given, highly dependent about the infrastructure in the hospital for connections to internet, but it's also like dependent on maybe what I'm going to talk about in my presentation, which is writing for VR. And I think maybe I'll answer it. I'm not sure.
Squeeze in one more.
One more, Anna.
Just really, really quick one. Do you know if anyone is working on VR in the space of working on literacy? Because if so, I want in, and I want to know who they are, and I want to read everything that they're working on.
Let's do it. We could do it together.
Literacy is in the language of VR, or like?
No, I mean as in educational applications for literacy development using VR. I keep looking for that because it seems so obvious to me and I can't find anything.
Well, we do. There is a book coming out soon. The lead is from Curtin University. Alex Munt, he's heading this book about virtual reality and screenwriting for VR. There might be something in there. We're just putting it together now. I'm not sure. I have to think about it, and I'll get back to you on that one.
Anyone finds any, please send it to me.
So, Guy, why don't we move over to you now and enjoy your presentation?
Well, thank you, Michael, for giving sort of like a contextual overview of the field of VR and where it's going and the project as a whole. I might talk about something a bit more specific in regards to VR, which is writing for VR. It's a little bit different to maybe like the methodological side of our project, which is sort of interdisciplinary and exciting, but there's a more like sort of fundamental question still emerging in VR, which is like, how do you even write for it? And like where, like if as Michael said, like if narrative doesn't work, then what does? And so that's sort of what I'm going to talk about now, which is sort of where my research is in sort of 360 immersive spaces. So I've been working with my supervisor, Dr. Daniel McEwen, on like a chapter for this Palgrave book, which is about emerging experiences and like the language of VR. So that's sort of where this comes from. So when we talk about VR, we're like intrinsically including like a wide variety of technologies and experiences. VR can be like as simple as a 360 video in like a Google Cardboard, or it can be like a full interactive cave experience with like a 3D goggles and stuff like that. But sort of what I'm exclusively going to talk about is like the VR that you see Mark Zuckerberg so fantastically modeling in the center there. So while there are like clear differences in head-mounted display technologies, there's a experiential commonality that's like a fundamental schism between a viewer's digitally manipulated sensorial immersion and their sort of physical somatic presence. So they all sort of cover that ground as far as it goes from 360 panorama to immersive spaces. So when I use the term VR, though, I'm sort of talking more broadly about the act of immersing someone in a VR headset, head-mounted display. So in these experiences, from like a 360 video to an interactive world, the fundamental basis of VR is space over time. In offering the viewer like a 360-degree field of view and the ability to explore a 3D space, VR is essentially adopting a spatio-temporal frame. And it's something in cinema we talk about, this spatial temporal frame. But even in the most technologically limited VR experiences, like the 360 panorama, we can sort of see the lineage of a viewer's spatial exploration, similar to that of like a theme park ride or walking through a cathedral. We sort of regard these experiences as like on rails. Even though they allow us to go anywhere, they're designed in a certain way that make us move towards certain sections, except for obviously the roller coaster, which is directly on rails. So as such, artists in VR need to determine the architecture of an environment, the space, and then the ability and or the speed of movement through the space, of the time to explore, and then the nature of the sensorial points of discovery, the opportunity to read the experience. So I think that's kind of relates more to like a cathedral. When you walk through a cathedral, although it doesn't say it's probably explicit that you shouldn't be running in there, and you know, you move at a certain pace and you look at objects for almost like a certain amount of time that is weirdly similar between people. And I think that's a really good thing to like think about when we think about VR space. So in this way of thinking about VR, even sort of incorporates open world game experiences, which have that added interactivity and embedded additional agency of interaction. As the spatio-temporal frame is one which both the ludological and the narratological techniques can be employed. So these are the two terms that I'm going to be like sort of discussing today. Ludology is like the idea that the meaning of the game is its experience. So the arrow is kind of weirdly wonky there, but it goes down to Tetris. So to simplify that, the ludology is the idea of that the meaning of the game experience can be derived from its mechanics and rules, while narratology argues the expression is derived from the underlying narrative. I don't know how many of you have played Halo, but like it exists. It's a narrative game where you basically run through and fight aliens. So Tetris, where it's just blocks, you're sort of putting blocks together. But in both sort of include variations of ludology and narratology, but it's sort of the reward for playing each game is entirely different. Like when you play Tetris, your reward is beating a point score, whereas your reward for playing the narrative games is the narrative itself. Sort of course, there's like exceptions to this rule, and most actually include a little bit of both. But one that Michael was talking about, Minecraft, sort of sits in between both ludology and narratology. There's probably an argument there that it depends on that simple block mechanics like Tetris for the creation of meaning through the narrative of collecting those blocks, surviving and building with those blocks. So that's a really good example perhaps of like a game in between those two ideas and perhaps where VR sits. These terms are like really important for what we use to make VR, which is game engines. Ultimately, these engines are like software hubs, and they have like multiple systems that plug in and to a central code and allow sort of designers from all different backgrounds to build real-time interactive digital content. So these engines, as you can see, can like simulate physics, use game logic, render light rays, all these wonderful stuff that's probably, you know, very technical, and it's not always necessary to understand what they're doing. But the thing about thinking about them is that we have to understand that some of their processes are biased towards certain outcomes, and they promote certain developmental literacies that can lead to VR experiences opting towards ludological or narratological outcomes in things like video games. So these game engines basically promote Tetris and Halo rather than like a different kind of experience, like a cathedral experience. So one example here is Beat Saber. So the problem with VR is that narrative is difficult. Narrative is really hard. And the participant in the case of interactive open world VR are given autonomy from the tracked, triggered experiences that we see in film or even narratology-based games. Cutscenes and like auto-managed character movements, things that happen in games, push participant in like certain spaces where they're supposed to discover the story. But in VR, this is really, really nauseating. So because your digital experience is sort of linked to your physical somatic presence, losing control of your body is not an ideal thing. So VR agrees much more with the ludological. So Beat Saber is basically you just hacking things to the beat of music. It's the same as Tetris, or the same. It's based on the mechanics rather than thinking about, oh, well, how could this space be reflective of a narrative? So that's sort of where my research sits, is this question of, okay, well, if narrative doesn't work, what strategies can like a VR artist do and employ to create experiences that allow for like a narrative-based or reflective experience for viewers? And I think this comes through in Future Stories. In Future Stories, we collaborate with patients to create their own VR worlds. I've sort of been exploring how to create these experiences that allow the facilitation of their vision, but to be guided by a different language other than those found in the video games or film, because I don't think it's necessary. The goal with like asking questions about where they would want to visit, such as the examples, this is the bike park I was talking about before, and I digitally recreated the foyer of the Children's Hospital as like a starting point. Is not to provide a narrativistic or ludological experience, but to facilitate an experience that reflects the desires of the let's say learner stuck in a sterile green tiled hospital room. In this employment, VR's sensory transportation allows for these patients a moment of physically somatic separation from their reality, and I think that's really important. But in order for them to be take a further breath from that world of like machine sounds and an IV chain, finding more effectual VR experiences is needed through the development of the actual language itself of VR. And so one of the common techniques for script writing is a story arc. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it establishes, you know, as a story arc goes, it establishes the story's complications and how they resolved in often revealing ways. And, you know, it's just a big bell curve. But what if we take this story arc and just apply it to a space instead? And we take already effective spaces like theme parks and cathedrals, and then simplify their areas into low and high active states. And we consider that like certain spaces give you more affectual value. So affectual is an art term we use for like emotional response to a space. So yeah, certain spaces give you more affectual value than others, such as like the crescendo dip on a roller coaster or the view from the bell tower in the cathedral. Because VR experiences function as a spatio-temporal experience, tactics and languages from screen-centric video games have less value here. And as such, VR experiences rely on the discovery of objects and environments to create meaning and narrative. And I think this is really important and shows in Future Stories that in one of the worlds, one of the learners created a moonscape, and I worked with him together to create a place that has many objects that activate on exploring with your hands in the space. And the VR participant could walk around the moon and pat this little dog here, Laika, which is the Russian space dog, as well as drive the virtual moon buggy as well. And so certain interaction with different objects offers these effectual responses and allows you to have that sort of bell curve experience as you go through the space. As the moonscape actually experienced, I don't have it here on the image, but there was one high point in the moonscape which you could drive the moon buggy to. And on that top high point, there was a special scanned 3D object. We scanned one of the learners' teddy bear and put it in the world. So I think that was like a really nice way to like create a space that was like, when you got to that area, that mountain, you discovered this little bear, and it's sort of like was almost a reflection of what the participant wanted you to see was actually these lovely little objects that they'd hidden around the place. So it forces you to discover things, and I think that's important. So I think that in this way, the audience members' movement through the environment and objects from which an experience can spatially affect the viewer. However, this is just the sort of surface of exploring throughout this field, and sort of further exploration is well out of the scope of this talk. But yeah, that's sort of it. Thank you.
Oh, wow, Guy, that is just such interesting work that you're engaging with at the moment.
Thanks.
And I love the correlations between your own research, but also the Future Stories, particularly in that exploration of the affective domain. And I'm curious if I can have the first question. I'm really curious about whether or not you're going to measure or observe or notice that in any way, the reaction, the impact that having items in that virtual reality that person has selected that are particularly important for them in their life.
Yeah, I think
you're going to reflect on that in any way, or whether you're going to observe that in any way.
I think part of this project is allowing them to put the objects where they want to. I'd never want to tell a participant to put an object where I thought it should go. I think the spaces sort of work the way that the participant imagines, and I mean, in the sort of as an artist and just knowing VR, when I design a space, it's about a consultation and a suggestion rather than a guideline. And I think especially with VR, its power remains in like the experience that the participant wants to show, right? Especially for this project. Yeah.
But
yeah, on your observation, I think that's a Michael question.
Was more a curiosity.
Yeah, me too. I'm very curious as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why, I mean, as you noticed on the team, we had a sociologist who specializes in this area. And so she will be primarily looking at qualitative research. Pediatricians, we thought the pediatricians would want lots of quant data, but they were very happy for us to just kind of go with the kind of qualitative stuff. And we wanted to obviously interview participant, kind of both kind of during and sort of after the process, but then also any family members who also wanted to participate in it. And particularly siblings, because siblings are a kind of really interesting dynamic in these relationships. And so interesting then to kind of incorporate their ideas about what their experiences of the world are as well. So it's really, and that's, if you come back to me in 3 years, I'll be able to let you know, but it's certainly part of the rich observation of it. Once it's, and as Guy said, it's very much about what they choose to put in the worlds is really where we are led. But then obviously some reflection on that is an interesting part of the research.
Absolutely. Over to any questions. What fascinating work.
Yeah, I have a question actually. As someone who has so little experience with VR, but thinking about it as an art form, Guy, like, you know how all the different art forms have their thing that they do better than the other, or not better than, but that they have, that's really, really special. With VR, like what would you say? Like, you know, in theatre, it's that kind of psychological reflection of stories, psychological reality, or like music, it's like these feelings, it engenders like these massive feelings in your body. For you as a VR aficionado, what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the power of VR it sits in its ability to bridge digital experience with the physical presence of a person and their senses. I think there are much better mediums to tell story than VR. And that's one of the things I left out accidentally in sort of this presentation, but some mediums are much better at telling story, and even paintings are sometimes better at telling story than VR can be, because in all its techno excitement, it sometimes overwhelms a viewer in a space. It's immersive, but it's not always clear, and that's its problem. With its 360 immersion, it's totally unclear what the message could be. With a painting, a composition can give you a clear meaning in seconds. And same with film, and same with and theatre. I'm no theatre person, but there's much better ways to tell story and much more engaging ways to tell story with other mediums. But VR's power sort of remains in that sort of ability to bridge digital experience, which is somewhat in screen-centric mediums, always seems flat and unengaging. And I think it allows the ability to transport the viewer into that actual digital realm and speak to the experiences we can't actually have in reality. But
it's that fantasy actually. That was the experience I had in the VR. Was being in this really cool New York loft with like this really hot guy playing piano, and it was this immersion in the fantasy.
Look, I'm conscious of time at the moment, and I know people have got places to go and things to do. So we might move on to the Pachucha part of our session.
Hi, I'm Tash, and I am a performer and arts educator writing my PhD thesis on video making in primary classrooms, fostering multimodal literacy, creative practice, and critical engagement with digital content. That's what it's called today. It changes all the time. There's 4 things I want to share with you today. One is the background, so how this has sprung from my own work contexts. The other is just some key concepts that are driving theories behind the pedagogy being explored, and the design methodology and problems. So this work sprang from initially, several years ago, I began working for STC's school drama program with the wonderful Robin Ewing, using drama to teach literacy. This opened my eyes to how literacy pedagogy can and should jump off the page. During lockdowns, I was teaching film skills to students online and began to be curious about video making as another form of literacy. Through my work at the Catholic Education Office, I began running video making programs as professional development in teachers' classrooms. The first key concept underpinning this pedagogy is multimodality. So the internet age has spawned an explosion in audiovisual content. Theorists Jewett and Kress help us consider how different communicative modes work in concert every time we make or view videos online. Digital videos are complex communicative texts. Mastery requires skill in script writing, editing, music selection, graphic and color choices, narration and performance skills. Concepts and stories are conveyed through a marriage of image, language, and sound. The second key concept is sociocultural creativity. Arts processes make important contributions to children's development, and video making provides a high engagement avenue for children to explore and express their learning. Sociocultural creativity understands collaboration between students as crucial to creative skill building. Making aesthetic decisions, discussing possibilities, working with others to execute a creative concept. Individual creativity can be activated and extended through contact with others. A third domain informing this pedagogy is critical theory and critical practice of media arts. With the emergence of more accessible media making software, educators celebrate the possibilities of new media to empower students as creators, not just consumers of media. As the internet and social media evolve, however, darker concerns need to be addressed. For students living so much of their lives online, issues such as algorithmic bias, disinformation, media siloing, and personal and reputational safety, just to name a few, are all aspects of being literate. Reflective media production pedagogy can help to address these concerns. This combines analytic and process-driven approaches to media arts, with students critically reflecting on the aesthetics and ideology of their own and others' work. Now turning to context, the research looks at video pedagogy being implemented in 3 different primary contexts in Western Sydney. Teachers will all be taking part in an embedded professional development in classroom video making run by yours truly. With a subtle suitcase clue. Yes, you guessed it. This is a case study. Data collected will include observational notes, post-program interviews, recordings of teacher meetings, and student video work samples. Students will be interviewed in focus groups at the end of the program. Notes and transcripts will undergo stages of coding for emerging themes and principal concepts. Student videos will be content analysed for elements of literacy and collaborative creativity. Awkward pause. Oh no, not too bad. Cultural historical activity theory provides another useful analytic framework for considering device-based learning. Wider technological and logistic systems often pose real barriers to teachers' use of technology, and this lens will help position these outside of the pedagogy itself. So that is a snapshot of the research as planned, but as some of you may have experienced, I'm not sure if you have, there have been some major holdups to data collection in schools this year, which I will now outline and publicly freak out about. So I am still waiting for my ethics approval from the Catholic Education Department. I applied in January, sent all these prodding emails, and have received nothing but an initial apology for delays due to new systems being in place. And now all school-based research is indefinitely suspended due to COVID. Another problem is that all the study participants are being drawn from this video making professional development program. And there's not that many schools doing the program in the second half of the year. One school is pulled out, and there's only one other school in the calendar for term 4. Finally, just a reflection. I was talking to a good friend recently whose daughter had made a multimodal video for school, and I thought that was great. And my friend's perspective was, it was such a waste of time. It's just lazy teachers not wanting to mark essays. A reminder of how media arts can be perceived. Nonetheless, I will end by noting that video is a ubiquitous part of our lives online, through the content we watch or being on camera ourselves in meetings and presentations like today. This is a medium that has found its moment and is loaded with creative potential.
Oh, Tash, congratulations. You found
Thank
your
you.
moment there in that presentation.
No, I can't get it out of it. Thank you, Sue. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
That was great.
Hey, Tash.
And Tash, I think you captured the roller coaster, the virtual reality roller coaster that your journey is. You're just hitting a bit of a dip at the moment.
Oh man, I'm starting to panic, but anyway, it'll all come good. Thanks, everyone. It's so nice to meet you, Brian.
We so appreciate you sharing, given that you're at a difficult stage in your journey at the moment, but it's so fascinating to hear what is incredibly interesting research and beautifully linked with our topics today as well, even though that was serendipitous. Look, I'm conscious of time now, and I'd just like, on behalf of all of us, to thank Michael and Guy in particular for their session this afternoon. We would love, and I know I speak for those of us who are here today, we would love a little bit later on for you to come back and revisit us once you've started to undertake more of your work. We would love to hear the journey, because we've been completely fascinated by the work, because of our experiences are very different. In fact, it's a real that intersectionality, isn't it, of different experiences, but we all have this common, very common interest in your work. Thank you for sharing with us today.
Thanks, and we were bonding with Natasha because our project has been stalled for like 6 months. Like, we got the grant, we're just waiting for the signing off, and because there's so many partners, it just it's not, so you're not alone.
Yes. Oh, you'd have so many moving parts to that project. Yeah.
So this recording will be uploaded via the YouTube channel on the Create site, if you're wanting to refer others to see it. But thank you everyone for engaging today. Apologies for the hiccup in Zoom at the very beginning. And in a couple of weeks' time, we've got another session coming up, so a fortnight from today. So keep an eye out for our next session, and go well, keep safe, and see you in a fortnight's time for those of you who are part of the group.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Fascinating.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Guy.
Farewell, everyone.
Bye, everyone.